Hello, everybody, and welcome to Swiping Through History. Today, I have a very exciting guest joining me to have a conversation with about the sources that talk about Richard III and where we get all of these kind of ideas from about him, having one shoulder higher than the other and being born with hair and teeth and all of these kind of things. I have the wonderful Matt Lewis here. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom. It was always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you so much for giving us your time on this very, very hot day. But yeah, so we're here today to talk a little bit more about the sources. We always reference them. We always grab quotes and kind of throw them into our discussions and say, oh, Mancini said this, or Thomas More said this, and I disagree with it because of this. But we very rarely actually look into detail about who these people were, why they were writing, and why they had the views that they had. And so today is all about hearing your thoughts in more detail about four particular sources: the Crowland Chronicle, Thomas More, Mancini, and John Rous. So they're the four guys we're going to really focus on. I'm sure we might mention some others in here as well. But just to start us off, as you said to me just before we started the recording, that we see it a lot happen today with modern journalists, don't we, where somebody will give a half-hour interview and then they'll take a short line or a short quip of something that somebody said and they'll post it all over the headlines, and suddenly, taken out of context, it can mean something very different from what the person was initially intending it to mean. So I imagine that a lot of that has kind of taken place with the sources with Richard III. So it will be really good to kind of clear some of those things up.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's a lot like the modern parallel of a journalist who, interview someone for half an hour, get lots of really great, interesting, deep dive stuff from them, but then they want the clickbait headline that sounds shocking because you take a sentence, move it slightly out of context, and make it look like it means something it was never really meant to mean. And you can do that. I mean, all of history is like that. You can take a source and you can take a sentence from it, and you can make the most positive source sound like it's saying something pretty horrible about its subject. And I think with Richard III, it's really dangerous to go around ones like More and Mancini and just pick a sentence and say, that's my conclusive evidence of this, without understanding the bigger picture of who these writers were, why they were writing, when they were writing, why they're saying what they say, what they might really mean, and what the bigger picture of what they write is. Let's not look at one sentence. Let's look at the whole body of work and what it says in the round, in the whole, and try and get a better picture of Richard III from that.
So why are these, to start off with, why are these particular sources so important? And why has, for example, More been taken and almost been taken more for gospel than many of the others? Why is it certain sources really stand out in the retelling of Richard's story, specifically in The Princes in the Tower? What is it that makes certain sources stand out more than others?
I think the four that we're going to talk about are really interesting because, I mean, the Crowland Chronicle, incredibly well informed, at the heart of events, someone we should be able to really rely on what they say. They had inside knowledge, and that should give us a real insight that we don't get from anywhere else. Someone like Mancini, a foreign eyewitness. So does he have that degree of detachment that means he has no skin in the game? He's got no real axe to grind for or against Richard. He's just kind of reporting what he sees, and that should make his testimony valuable to a historian as well. And Rous, knew Richard, was a historian of the Earls of Warwick. So he includes Richard and his brother George because they're married to the sisters who are the daughters of the Earl of Warwick, Isabel and Anne Neville. And so Rous was, again, a contemporary and around these people at the time. And to some extent, More is the most inexplicable because he's writing this in the 1510s, 30 years after all of this happened. More was 5-6 years old when all of this is going on. He's the one who is not an eyewitness to what's gone on. He's the one, people will often say he's gathering testimony from people who were there at the time, but it's testimony that he's gathering 25, 30 years later of an event that now has a certain reputation because that dynasty, the Plantagenet dynasty, has ended. The Tudors are there instead. And there are reasons to be careful about what you say. If you start saying Richard III was a great guy, then you're saying the Tudors were pretty awful for taking the crown off him. So there is an imperative to be very careful with what you say. So some extent, More is the most influential source that we have, and the least reliable, the most detached from all of the events. So it's odd that he's the one that everybody hangs this picture of Richard III on, and particularly, you know, the Princes in the Tower. More is the source that everybody will quote for, this is what happened, this is how it happened, problem solved. But he's, of the four we're going to talk about, the one I would rely on the least.
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? How we can never explain how, you know, for example, in the modern day, how certain things go viral and certain things don't. There's never really an explanation for it. It's just something seems to either capture the imagination of people, and that seems to be it. And I think it sounds like with More that there was definitely an element of that, with the way he kind of puts in writing this kind of you know, this depiction of what Richard does to the princes, but also the fact that More didn't actually finish it. You know, it was finished by somebody else and released after his death as well. So that, again, you know, removes it once more in terms of its kind of, you know, is it fully More's voice anyway? Because it's
a lot like, you know, well. if I half finished a book and then I popped my clogs and my nephew came along, it's exactly what happened with More's book. My nephew comes along 10 years after I've died and finishes writing it all, edits it all, you know, we don't know what changes were made to the manuscript either, and publishes it under my name. Would I be looking down and thinking, hang on, you're putting words in my mouth now?
Yeah, you probably
I didn't finish this for a reason. I put it aside. You can't just pick it up, write the ending, change whatever you want in it, and still publish it as a Thomas More book. That's not how that works. You know, if I imagine More might be slightly horrified if he was looking down at the fact that we're even reading this, never mind that we're relying on it as a true account of history.
Yeah. So going back to like the Crowland Chronicle, for example, do we actually know specifically the person who was writing this, or would it have been a variety of people? Would it have been a group of monks? How would this have been put together?
So the Crowland Chronicle is also sometimes called Ingolf's Chronicle. It tells hundreds of years of history based at Crowland Abbey in Lincolnshire. And this is what's called a continuation. So this is a section that deals with sort of the Wars of the Roses period. So there is lots that goes before it that's been written over the centuries by monks at Crowland. Not necessarily all reliable, but this is a continuation that deals with the Wars of the Roses. We don't know the name of the author. He writes this anonymously in the spring of 1486. So he's sitting after the Battle of Bosworth. He goes up to Crowland Abbey, writes in this chronicle a big continuation of what's happened over the last kind of 30 years or so of history to get it down. And
that's all
there's a lot of suggestion.
In 86.
Yeah, March 1486, he wow. dates what he writes to. So there was a long time it was thought this could have been John Russell, who was Richard's Chancellor. He's a bishop and a Chancellor, high government official to Edward IV and Richard III. But it's kind of generally accepted now that it probably wasn't John Russell himself. Some of the information that the Crowland Chronicle gives about going on embassies to Burgundy and stuff like that doesn't fit with John Russell. But he's clearly someone who is inside Yorkist government throughout. He's someone who, if he doesn't sit on Edward IV's council, he's there, you know, taking the meeting minutes. You know, he's that kind of person. He's in the room when a lot of this stuff is going on. He clearly is very well informed, very well aware of what's happening. And so for me, his testimony bears a lot of weight because he's at the center of it. He has the slight benefit of anonymity. You know, he maybe can write with a bit more freedom because he's not putting his name to it. So no one's going to come knocking on the door and say, well, what's this? What have you said? So there are lots of reasons we should listen to what the Crowland Chronicler has to say, although that date of 1486 means we have to just have a little bit of caution about when he's writing. I mean, I've said before, I wonder whether the Crowland Chronicle, that continuation, is somebody going to Crowland Abbey and kind of doing a big download of everything they know. You know, the narrative is now being written by a completely new dynasty. This is someone who was there, who was involved in all of those events, and who wants to set the record straight, you know, before they forget, before the official story twists everything and really takes hold. They want to set down the Wars of the Roses as they have lived through it. So it's kind of this big brain dump. It may have been more than one writer. There may have been several people who got together, and this could be, you know, a big brain dump from a whole load of people who were involved behind the writing of the Crowland Chronicle, this man who was at the centre of government and politics. So incredibly important source. We don't know who writes it, which is problematic. His anonymity perhaps actually in some ways makes him slightly more reliable because he doesn't have to worry about the consequences of what he writes. We have to be aware of when he's writing. And the one thing we don't know is why he's writing, other than to get this stuff down. Does he have any kind of agenda that we're not aware of? We don't know.
Sweet. So would he have been anonymous at the time? Like the Crowland Chronicle at the time, was that something that everybody knew about, like in the higher circles of the people who could read and write? Was that like is that like the Guardian or the Times writing something today, or was it more unknown at the time and it was more kind of, you know, niche and somebody, you know, it would have been anonymous? Or would people have known who did reside at the Abbey in Crowland and who would have been writing for it? Is it just that he's anonymous now because we don't have that information? Would he have been anonymous then?
I think there would have been a small pocket of people, you know, the monks at Crowland would have known who he was. If he wasn't one of them, he's someone who turned up in late 1485 or early 1486 and locked himself in a room somewhere and scribbled all of this stuff down. You know, they would have known this guy's turned up and this is what he's doing. Part of the problem with this period is that we're in this kind of cavernous gap between most of the big monastic chronicles have stopped. So Crowland hasn't been kept up to this point. This is someone who goes in 1486 and writes backwards to fill in, you know, a big gap. Most of the big abbeys and monasteries have stopped their chronicles, and we're in a period before we get the big bulk of government documentation that we get when Thomas Cromwell arrives in the mid 16th century and you know, revolutionizes the civil service that we've got today. So you've got this big gap where you don't have the monastic chronicles anymore, and you don't have the government paperwork yet, which is part of the problem with studying this period, that the sources are so sparse. So I think people would have been aware that there was a chronicle at Crowland because there were lots of big abbeys and monasteries and places like that. People may not have necessarily been familiar with that specific one, but I think people would have known that it existed, and people would probably have known that suddenly, you know, something's been added to it at some point, which is perhaps why the writer was keen to remain as anonymous as he possibly could.
Yeah. So let's talk about how it talks about Richard and what you think about its portrayal of Richard and what we can learn about Richard from it, what you think we can take, you know, with confidence, and what you think we should be more wary about taking from the Crowland Chronicle.
I think in general, it's a really strong account of that whole period of the Wars of the Roses. It's obviously Yorkist in its bias. This is someone who is close to Edward IV.
It's very, very, it praises Edward IV's reign a lot, doesn't it? I mean,
Edward is very much the golden boy of the Crowland Chronicle. So
when we get to his death, they talk about how he was a devout Catholic, you know, and that he was the ideal kind of man, a human being. Meanwhile, we know, you know, it doesn't pick up much on his frivolous activity that was obviously very well known and documented at the time as well. But
ignore the mistresses. Don't worry too much about all the naughty stuff he did.
Yeah, exactly. I was kind of wondering, is because of that kind of religious affiliation, that religious connection, you know, would Edward have, you know, donated, like in his will and testament, a lot of money to the church? Is there a reason why that the Crowland Chronicle is praising him in that way? Is there something else in the background that is a reason why it's biased towards Edward, or is it more, as you say, is it more somebody just within Edward's court who is a big supporter of Edward?
I think to some extent this writer is at the core of everything that Edward's government has done. And so this may well be as much about this writer's legacy as it is about Edward's legacy, because if Edward was brilliant and did great things, then this guy is associating himself with brilliant government, fantastic things happening and all that kind of stuff. And this is why I wonder whether this is kind of a big brain dump in the early period of the Tudors, because as the narrative begins to change and be shaped, he may have been worrying about, Richard III is being painted as the evil monster who has to be defeated. He may have been wondering how far back that would go. Would Henry be keen to denigrate the rest of the Yorkist efforts in the Wars of the Roses, including Edward IV's government? So was this an effort for him to say, do you know what, actually Edward did some really good things. He was a good guy. I helped him do all of this stuff. I was closely associated with this, and I need to protect my own legacy as much as I want to protect Edward's out of loyalty to his king. I was involved in all of these things. And so I want to protect my own legacy as well by setting down the good things that happened. And, maybe there's an element of him saying, you can have Richard as the monster. I'm less precious about that. I can see the political imperative for Richard to be a monster now, but actually I want to set the record straight about Edward. So he's less concerned about Richard's reign. He's not trying to protect or save Richard. He's trying to protect or save Edward in case Henry looks to move his focus even further back. And it may well be that that's about protecting his own legacy as much as protecting Edward's, because particularly during Edward's reign, he's absolutely, for a source that's generally considered to be anti-Richard, he's really, really positive about Richard in many, many places, up to the point where Richard becomes king. He's not particularly nice about him then. So, for example, it's Crowland who gives us the story that Richard goes and saves Anne Neville from George and Isabel's clutches. So they sort of abduct her to stop her remarrying, to split the inheritance, and keep her in one of their houses in London. And Crowland is the one that gives Richard this kind of chivalric, heroic moment where he goes and saves Anne, retrieves her from custody. And rather than that being about him immediately marrying her to get everything that she's got hold of, Crowland says he puts her into sanctuary, almost as if she's now going to be allowed to decide her own future. This is Richard saving a damsel in distress, but not for his own gain. He then gives her a bit of control over her own future, if you like. So he's actually really, when there's all the disputes about the Warwick inheritance, when Richard does marry Anne, he praises both George and Richard's legal skills and says, they make incredible arguments that trained professional lawyers would have been hard put to set out as well as they do. And he talks about, if the three brothers York had ever managed to actually get on with each other, they would have been this triple knot that would have tied England to the Yorkist dynasty forever. But obviously we know that wasn't to happen.
It sounds like, from what you're saying, it sounds very much a little bit like the problem that he is the voice in a way of the Yorkist dilemma that they had when Edward IV died unexpectedly, and suddenly they had Edward V, who was too young to be on the throne, and they had Richard, but they also had the threat of the Woodvilles, and actually the Yorkists themselves being split between, do they follow Richard or do they fight for the legitimacy of Edward V? It sounds very much like, in a way, that's the route he takes, that he is in that dilemma himself, and that he chooses the side of the legitimacy of Edward V and Edward IV, rather than supporting Richard in what Richard does.
And it may be that that's part of his efforts to protect himself, because, again, we have to be conscious he's writing in 1486. He's looking back, and Richard has been king for 2 years and brought the Yorkist dynasty to an end. So it is perhaps in Crowland's interest to say that that's all Richard's fault, not Edward's. Edward is the golden boy. Edward IV's legacy would have been perfect and great if only Edward V had become king, and Richard kind of ruins that. So that's the break. It's not anything that Edward did wrong. Richard is able to kind of take the blame for everything that happened there and be the kind of the fall guy for the loss of Yorkist power and authority.
Isn't there? There's one other source. One of the sources, I think, is either John Rous or Mancini. Actually, they put some of the blame on Edward IV for what happens next, which is obviously not what the Crowland is doing. But I can't remember.
There's lots of the sources that talk afterwards, and people like Moore and Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed, lots of the later Tudor sources, will always paint this really dramatic deathbed scene with Edward, where he's got Lord Hastings and Thomas Grey, his so his stepson, sorry, the Marquis of Dorset, who absolutely hate each other's guts. And Edward, you get this deathbed scene where he's pleading with them for the sake of England and his son and everything else to, you know, shake hands, kiss and make up, all of this sort of thing. And, you know, and they shake hands and Edward dies thinking everything is sorted. But what that really points to is the fact that there was all of this tension right there, just below the surface when Edward dies. And I think possibly, I mean, Edward dies at 40, so perhaps he wouldn't have foreseen his own death coming. But perhaps his biggest failure was that he left a situation in which I describe Edward as the cork in the bottle of all of these problems. His personality, everybody loves Edward. He's a fantastic guy. He's the kind of guy you want to go to the pub with, but you don't necessarily want to have to work with him because he's not the most reliable person in the world. He'll buy you a round down the pub, but he'll be late for work and drop you in it all the time. But everybody loves him, and he can keep a lid on all this stuff because Hastings and Thomas Grey hate each other's guts, but they're both loyal to Edward, and he can control that while he's there. The issue is, as soon as he's gone, as soon as that bottle is uncorked, it just explodes all over the place. And he left no mechanism to deal with that. I think his intention when he realized he was dying unexpectedly was that his brother Richard would come down and deal with precisely what he knew was going to happen. Yeah. And I think to some extent Richard does, because he comes down, and I always say, I think if someone could contact Edward IV spirit in 1483 and say the price of your son succeeding to your crown successfully is the death of Hastings and Anthony Rivers, I think Edward would have said, we'll do it. Yeah. You know, what do I care about them two? I want my son to succeed. And so I think to some extent, Richard, before whatever changes that he, you know, makes his move for the crown or gets asked to take the crown, however you want to phrase that, I think he does make genuine efforts to have Edward V crowned. And I think perhaps to some extent executing Hastings and Rivers is cutting the two heads off the two snakes that are causing problems. But yeah, so there is just this heavy dose of hindsight, particularly with Crowland, where I think he's happy for Richard to be the fall guy for everything that fails. And I think you can see that contrast in, so the 1482 Christmas Court, Edward IV's last Christmas Court. Crowland talks about how great it was lavish, it was fantastic, everybody's singing, eating whatever they want to eat, absolutely, you know, drunk off their faces, everyone has a brilliant time, it's amazing. 1483 Christmas Court under Richard III, it's incredibly lavish, everybody's singing, dancing, everybody's eating as much as they can possibly eat. Isn't that awful? What a terrible man he is. Yeah. And it's almost exactly the same thing. And to some extent you wonder whether these writers, medieval writers, like artists, you know, they were good at putting messages in things that we don't look for because we take what we read too literally these days. When he's writing something like that and he's saying, you know, in 1482 Edward does this and it's brilliant, in 1483 Richard does pretty much the same thing and it's dreadful, that's a nice big signpost to the fact that, you know, I'm treating the two people differently here. Perhaps I've got
ironic,
reasons.
Isn't it? It's actually quite ironic. Like Shakespeare uses irony a lot in his writing, where actually, if you read it straight, you don't actually bring it to life in the same way as actually he's being ironic with things that he says. And I think let's use this as a chance to move on to John Rous, for example, because I think one of the things you mentioned with the Crowland Chronicle is that there is this slight shift. I don't think it's as dramatic as John, but there is this slight shift as when Richard isn't trying to become king, and it's before we get to that stage of 1483. He actually speaks quite highly of him on a number of occasions. Obviously, John Rous is another prime example, if not the best example in the sources, of somebody who changes his mind about Richard within his own writing and goes from hailing him as I think you said earlier, that the greatest prince there ever was or something, to suddenly being the Antichrist. I mean, it's a huge shift. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so John Rous is a Warwickshire antiquarian, so, you know, a historian effectively, and his main interest is the Earls of Warwick. So previously the Beauchamp family, and then we get Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, sort of marries into that. So the Beauchamp family becomes the Nevilles, and George and Richard are included in his writing because they're married to Warwick's daughters, Isabel and Anne.
He brings Richard up as well. Is that right? Richard is
Richard spends some time in Warwick's care, so yes. 2 or 3 years of his sort of early teenage years before Warwick falls out with Edward IV. So that, you know, there is this connection, this pre-existing connection to the family as well. And so Rous, you know, writes his history, and he writes it when Richard is king. And so he's absolutely fulsome in his praise of Richard. You know, this guy is absolutely amazing. Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he incredible? And this is typical of what we see throughout Richard's life. So, I mean, for example, if we go back even further, there is a poem that's written after the Battle of Barnet in 1471 when Richard is 18. And it talks about what an incredible soldier it is. And it likens him to, you know, the Greek heroes of old. And the poem talks about Edward and other people that are at the battle, but Richard is the one who's singled out. He's the only one compared to a Greek hero kind of thing. So he is someone who is built up by people who know him.
My Ricardian ears, I'm not going to lie.
There is lots of people around him throughout his life who clearly see a lot in him. Yes, you know, you praise the rich and mighty because that's how you get on in life, but he's often singled out in this kind of way. And, you know, we get during his lifetime as well, Thomas Langton, the Bishop of St. David's, talks about Richard on his progress. He says, you know, people, wherever he goes, people offer him money and say how amazing he is. And Richard turns down the money and says, you know, I don't want your money, I want your love. And, you know, he's writing that, you know, he's the greatest prince that we've ever had. You know, God has sent him for the good of all of us and all of this kind of thing. And Rous is very much in that boat at the same time. Richard is an incredible guy, amazing king. The world's going to be great now he's in charge. Battle of Bosworth comes, 22nd of August, 1485. All of a sudden, Richard's dead. Henry VII is king. And we get Rous literally, you know, scurrying around the country, collecting up copies of his manuscript that says how nice and amazing Richard is. And he rewrites it all in fashionable Latin, dedicates it to Henry VII. And all of a sudden, this is the Richard who is carried in his mother's womb for 2 years. He's born with a full set of teeth, shoulder-length hair, sharp fingernails, you know, sent to scratch and bite at the world and all of this kind of stuff. And I mean, Rous is the only source that mentions Richard having uneven shoulders. And I think the reason that for a long time it was felt that that probably wasn't true, you know, we've got the evidence from portraits that they were doctored later. The x-rays show that raised shoulders were added and things like that. Yeah. And I think the reason we discounted Rous saying he had raised shoulders because it's in the middle of all of this in his mother's womb, you know, just physically, medically impossible stuff. But and then he throws in this one bit of truth.
Exactly. And that's interesting in a way, because it does show, I think, his closeness with Richard, or the fact that he would have known him. Because I think I've often thought about this, the fact that Richard's, you know, his scoliosis would not have been something that he would have been comfortable sharing. It would not have been something that people would have really been talking about or been, you know, allowed to talk about in his presence. It would have been something that he probably would have tried to hide and compensate for in every possible way, you know, looking at his ability to fight. I mean, you know, he would have had that disadvantage in a way, and he would have worked even harder to overcome that. And I think it really shows that actually there must have been some, he must have been, John must have had a closeness to him, not necessarily personally, but been connected with his closer circles to actually know the truth in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible, but it's also interesting to consider why more stories of Richard's scoliosis don't come out after his death. We know at Bosworth he's killed, his body's stripped and he's thrown over a horse. So at that point, hundreds, potentially thousands of people can see this curvature of his spine and his uneven shoulders. It's possible that Rous didn't know it before that and that he picked it up then, but you almost have to wonder why every source that's written after this period doesn't mention the fact that Richard had scoliosis and uneven shoulders. Sort of Rous jumps on it and includes it in his work, along with all of these other ridiculous charges that we have to discount. But you can discount the scoliosis because nobody else is talking about it. You know, Crowland doesn't talk about it. He's writing in 1486 after the Battle of Bosworth, when everyone would have known, you know, rumours would have surely have got round. He's still at the centre of government in the early Tudor years. You would think he would have heard that story. Nobody else is mentioning it. So it's kind of one of those weird things. You wonder why more people don't write about Richard's uneven shoulders after Bosworth.
As you say as well, like the religious element, for example, with the Crowland Chronicle, or you know, religiously, the idea of him having that deformity would not have played well into his popularity and into his, you know, the fact that a king on earth was God, it was a God-given right, but then he's got a deformity. Like you as you say, it seems like the perfect weakness to attack and to make use of, which obviously John does, but none of the others
except
do.
that, again, you know, if you think about what Rous is actually saying, he wraps up this one bit of truth alongside, you know, half a dozen medically impossible accusations. Is this his signpost? You know, I'm always looking for this signpost in what people are writing. Is this his signpost that, you know, I'm writing that Richard's a horrible monster here, but there's reasons why I'm doing it. You know, what I'm saying isn't necessarily true. Some of it isn't even
very
possible.
easily discountable, isn't it? It's very like, and the thing is, as soon as somebody has written something like that, as something ridiculous as the fact that he was in the womb for 2 years and came out with a full head of hair and teeth, you kind of go, well, that's BS in a way. Excuse my French.
That's it. You know, I'll stop reading that. You're never going to read that list of things that he says and go, oh, that one about uneven shoulders, that's the one that's probably true.
But it also make you end up discrediting the earlier stuff that he says as well? As a historian who examines that source, does it make you almost put that one on the back burner when you move forward? Is that the sort of impact that something like that would have?
I think he always has to be read in much wider context of other sources, because what we don't know is which one of the things that Rous says is true, if either of them. You know, is it hyperbole and praise for Richard while he's alive because he's king and you want him to patronize your work and you suck up to the boss? Or is it hyperbole denigrating Richard after his death to try and ingratiate yourself to the new Tudor dynasty and provide them with ammunition that they can use against Richard to paint him as this monster who had to be removed from the throne? Which one of those is true, or are they just both massive exaggerations for political purposes at the time? It's really hard to understand which one of those is true and which one we should rely on. So there's almost a temptation for me just to discount all of what Rous says, except that we know this scoliosis thing that he says ends up being true. The one thing that he says that is true.
So what's actually at stake for these writers at this time? Obviously, Mancini's a foreigner, so he's a little different. Thomas More is writing later, so he is obviously, you know, but for Rous in the Crowland Chronicle, like, what is at stake if they do turn around and say, under the reign of Henry VII, that the kings preceding him were not bad. They had their good things, they had their faults, but a more kind of, let's say like an analysis of their kingship, you know, but in that analysis ends up saying positive things about them. What do they risk there? Is this a world where Henry would just have the work burned? Would he have them executed? Like, for them personally, what is at stake? I
mean, to some extent, they do risk their necks. Right. You know, they risk their lives. The early years of the Tudor regime, we sometimes forget how fragile it is, because we know it goes on to last 124 years. In that first couple of years, Rous and the Crowland Chronicle are probably writing in 1486 in the early months of that. This is before the Battle of Stoke Field the following year. So before Lambert Simnel, before Perkin Warbeck, before lots of these threats. Henry VII is not secure on his throne, and what he doesn't need, he's very much positioned himself as saving England from this terrible tyrant usurper who murders children. What he can't have is people saying, well, you know what, actually he was quite a nice guy. We didn't actually need you to come and do this, because his whole legitimacy is built on saving the country from an evil king. If people are writing that king isn't so bad. And I think we can see evidence of the risks that were involved in Crowland's anonymity. He only wants to talk nicely about Edward IV, but he still doesn't want to put his name to it. He's scathing about Richard III's reign, but he still won't put his name to it because he's been nice about Edward IV. Rous, you know, his name is on the stuff that says Richard is amazing, so he collects it all up and completely rewrites it in an effort to ingratiate himself to Henry VII. And aside from saving your life, it's about patronage. You know, royal patronage is how you get rich, put food on the table, make a living. So you have to say what the monarchs want to hear to some extent. And so for Rous to have a piece of work out there that says Richard is amazing is incredibly dangerous to his life, but also means he's unlikely to get more work from the royal court. So by repackaging it to give Henry VII this kind of set of ammunition that he can fire off at Richard. You know, Henry doesn't have to say Richard's a monster because someone else is doing it for him. But actually that suits Henry to some extent. He has to have that narrative around him and around Richard. So Rous is protecting himself, but also looking for royal patronage and money. So I think you can see the dangers in the way they both write, but particularly for Rous, you can also see the benefit of the way he changes his story and why you would want to do that.
But just in terms for time, let's then talk about a little bit about Mancini. I think we haven't really talked much about him yet. Obviously, he is the foreign eyewitness account who actually didn't even speak English. I want to start with, was that a big thing at the time? Obviously, English, the common language. How much was it used in the court circles?
I mean, English was the language of the land. You know, French wasn't used quite so much at court as it had been.
Okay.
Monarchs and people around the court would be relatively fluent in French. You know, Edward IV, when he writes to Louis XI in 1475 about his invasion of France, it's not the best French you've ever heard in your life, but you know, he keeps it up. He's maybe on a C or a D at GCSE French. You know, he's getting by. But so English is what's used around London, but London is also still at this time an incredibly cosmopolitan city. Mancini was Italian, so there's lots of Italian merchants in London. There's lots and lots and lots of Italian merchants that travel all the way up through France to sell their wares in London and in England. So he would have been able to speak to them. And Latin is, you know, a common language, particularly amongst the clergy and those who work in the law and things like that. So he would have been able to communicate with people at that level as well. What he wouldn't have been very good at is picking up the gossip around town. You know, I think he seems to rely an awful lot on gossip, but it must have come from Italian merchants and things like that, because you know, he couldn't just wander down London streets and earwig over conversations in the pub because he didn't speak English. We know he never met any of the central people involved. He never met Richard III or Edward V or Buckingham or anybody like that. The only source that he names is Dr. John Argentine, who was a physician to Edward V, who was dismissed, eventually ends up on the continent with Henry VII, Henry Tudor, and ends up being physician to Prince Arthur Tudor. So, you know, he's lost out on this deal for whatever reason, wherever you might believe that Argentine was dismissed or whatever else. So Argentine does have an axe to grind in this situation. What we don't know is how much of Mancini's information comes from Dr. Argentine. You know, is this an attack piece from a disgruntled former servant of Edward V, either because he thinks Edward's been killed by Richard, or because he just didn't like being dismissed from his office where he was doing quite nicely, thank you very much, and he goes kind of on the attack. But otherwise, he can only have been picking up bits of gossip from Italian merchants around London, which you can't be sure how reliable that possibly is. But I think the biggest thing with Mancini is the whole context in which he's writing. There is a much bigger picture. So he's Italian, but his patron, the person who sent him over to England, is at the French court. So it's Angelo Cato, who's the Archbishop of Vienne, who is a councillor, the personal chaplain and personal physician to Louis XI, the King of France. So that should ring alarm bells in the medieval period. The King of France having someone connected to him in London around events that are unfurling there. England and France had largely been at peace since 1475, since Edward IV's invasion. He's bought off at the Treaty of Picquigny, and Louis gives Edward this annual payment effectively to stop attacking him. We know that at the end of 1482, Louis stops making that payment to Edward. During 1482, England has been at war with Scotland. So Richard has led this campaign into Scotland. And trouble with Scotland is often a precursor to trouble with France. The French will often use the Scots to stir up trouble on the northern border to detract attention. We know that when Edward dies, the chronicles all tell us that French shipping is attacking English shipping in the Channel. And in the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, there are raids on southern coast towns of England by French shipping. So I think Louis XI is looking to restart the 100 Years' War at this point. I think he sees Edward as a really soft target now, and he's positioned himself to be able to go on the offensive. And so then you have to wonder why someone who works for his personal physician and personal chaplain is meandering into London
at that time, precisely that time, because that's when he's there, isn't he?
But we're not sure when he arrives. So we know he leaves before Richard's coronation, which is the 6th of July 1483. He's gone by then.
Yeah.
We don't know precisely when he arrives. He could have been in London for a couple of months. He could have been there for 6 months, maybe 9 months, probably no longer than the middle of 1482.
And he happens to want to write a book about it.
But the thing is, he doesn't. This is the other thing. If you read Mancini in his own introduction, he writes it to Angelo Cato, and he says, I've done my best to resist writing this. You've begged me and pleaded me, and told me you really want me to write down this story that I've been telling to lots of people. So I get the impression that Mancini has done really well on the after dinner speaker circuit when he's got back to France. He's in England when all this stuff's happened and everybody wants to hear it. So he's standing up and he's given all of these talks saying, this awful stuff going on, really dramatic, making his after dinner speech sound absolutely amazing. And someone says, can you write this down? And he very clearly says, I'm going to have to be very careful what I write. I can't be as free in writing this down as I have been in my speaking, which suggests to me that he's been embellishing this story for the benefit of his audience.
This is interesting though, isn't it? Because the rumors were spreading on the continent a lot about these rumors of the murdering the princes in the Tower. They did really take heed in France, didn't they? And
all of the early
if he's been there doing the chat, then he's obviously he's a great example of proof of that in a way, if he's saying that in his source.
Yeah, so all of the early certainty that Richard had definitely murdered the princes in the Tower comes from France. And they obviously have a political agenda here, because Louis XI will die within weeks of Edward IV, and then France is faced with a minority crisis of its own. Charles VIII comes to the throne at 13 years old, and all of a sudden it's sort of it's Uno reverse card played. They were going to attack England. The king died. They probably thought, we'll get a 12-year-old on the throne. That'll be even better. And then all of a sudden they've got this man, this militarily accomplished man, who was actually quite keen on war with France, on the throne, while their king is dying and being replaced by a 13-year-old boy. And from 1485 to 1487, France slips into a period of civil war known as the Mad War, where there's a big fight over the regency of the young Charles VIII. So they have their own internal problems at a time when they've just tried to start a war with England, and they now have to worry about England sort of reciprocating and coming back at them. And we know Mancini writes his account in December 1483, and we know that where he's sitting writing it, there is also a man named Guillaume de Rochefort in the same place at the same time, and we have reason to believe that they were acquainted with each other. And Guillaume de Rochefort in January 1484 will make a speech to the French Parliament saying Richard III's murdered his nephews and stolen the crown. Isn't he an awful, terrible person? Where did he get that story from? Most likely for my money, Mancini. And that, for me, that's a little bit of, again, these political subtext. This is the French saying, we don't want to be like the horrible English across the channel. They're a terrible bunch. They murder children. They get tyrants on the throne.
I mean, we've had it throughout history. I mean, the British had that propaganda about the Nazis putting babies on, or the Germans putting babies on spikes during the First World War, didn't they? Not the Nazis, that was the Second World War. But the First World War, they were sending out leaflets of Germans with babies on their bayonets and things like that. So,
and if you read almost any medieval chronicle about a war with Scotland, the English monks will tell you that the Scots came down, stabbing pregnant women, cutting babies' heads off, murdering all the old people. It's like there's just these tropes that have lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. If you want to denigrate someone, this is what you accuse them of. Yeah. But Mancini, so in his introduction, he literally says to us, "Don't believe what I say." He very literally, very carefully says to us, "I don't know the names of the people involved in this. I don't know the places. I don't know the periods of time, the passages of time between events. I don't know what men's secret plans were. I really don't know. And you need to," he says, "treat my work with caution." Yeah, he says, "treat my work with caution." So I think then if you read Mancini without the caution that he has told you to take, that's just reckless.
Yeah. But it sounds then like his source then becomes a really good example of the rumors that were spreading. And actually you can almost take it as an example of that, because obviously we do know that rumors were spread, and obviously rumors are a key part of political play in the highest circles, because it's what you can make people believe. And actually,
he's also a good example of those rumors, but also how you can get them a little bit wrong. So Mancini is the only source that tells us that the sermon that was delivered by Ralph Shah in June 1483 about the bigamy of Edward IV. Mancini is the only source that says that sermon included a charge that Edward IV was illegitimate. Nobody else says that was said. If you ask most people what the charge was in 1483, they'll tell you it was that Edward IV was illegitimate, and when that proved unpopular, it was changed to bigamy. In fact, every other source says it was bigamy and nothing else from the start. Mancini says it was the illegitimacy of Edward IV. And I think this is because he speaks no English, he hears rumours, there's a sermon, it's something about illegitimacy or whatever else. Well, the big famous story in France was this idea that Edward IV was the son of a giant archer named Blayborn as a result of his mother having an affair. It was one of Louis XI's favourite jokes to talk about all the time. So if Mancini heard something about illegitimacy, but he didn't know what it was because he didn't speak English, he would put 2 and 2 together and get 5.
Yeah.
Because he'd get the illegitimacy of Edward IV. It's either that, or he goes back to France and as part of his after dinner speech, he can play into Louis XI's favourite joke about Edward IV. He can really play up to that and say, they brought it up in England. It's so true that they're even talking about it in London now. So either way, it demonstrates how those rumours existed, but also could have got twisted, misinterpreted. They travel over time and space and distance, and they get warped and changed and altered. So I don't think in June 1483 there was ever a claim that Edward was illegitimate. I think Mancini just misunderstands that.
Okay, so let's move on to the last one then. I mean, we've talked about him a little bit already, but just to finish off, Thomas More. So obviously, so we've had the two that changed their minds. We've had Mancini, who's the kind of the foreigner, and then we have More, who kind of he's almost like the second cousin, isn't he, in a family dynamic where he's once removed. He's kind of taking info from Morton and Virgil, is it to kind of formulate his opinion. And obviously there's been talk about people trying to justify that he was a good man, and that he was he wanted to convey the truth. I mean, what are your thoughts on it? He's obviously the one that you said earlier that he's the one in a way that we should listen to the least. But yeah, what else do you have to say about it, really?
I think More's interesting because you've got these two views of More. You've got St. Thomas More, the lawyer who would never tell a lie. And against that, you've got the Thomas More who persecuted Protestants and is accused of torturing them in his cellar, and had some shady legal dealings and all that sort of stuff. So again, we've got these two ideas of who Thomas More was before we even start. But my problem with More is, so people say, he was talking to people who were around at the time. But as we've already talked about with people like Rous and the Crowland Chronicler, people have reasons to say what they say after 1485. If he's talking to Thomas Stanley and people that knew Thomas Stanley and were involved in that side of things, who are still around, the Stanleys are still doing quite well for themselves. They're not going to say, we abandoned Richard traitorously on the field at Bosworth because it suited our ends better to have Henry as king. That's not how anyone is going to package what they did there. They also have vested interest now in Richard being the monster who had to be deposed. So if he's hearing testimony, he's hearing testimony that is shaded by 20, 30 years of a new Tudor regime and a story that's been around. And who's going to step out of line and say, you know what, Richard was great. Yeah. But I also think we kind of missed the point with Thomas More. So there's a quote by C.S. Lewis who says that allegory is the greatest barrier between us and our ancestors, because we don't understand, like I mentioned before, we often don't look for the hidden meanings in what people used to write. We treat it as plain text. They mean what they say on the page. And so the first sentence of Thomas More's account talks about Edward IV living to a number of years and months and days. So 52 years, it's 9 months and some days or something like that, when he dies at Westminster. Very first sentence, wrong. Edward was 40. So he's 12 years out. So if this is a guy who fastidiously checks his facts, he's wrong in the very first sentence that he writes. But I wonder whether that's More's signpost. So again, I'm looking for my signposts. Is this More's signpost about what he's really writing? Because interestingly, Henry VII is very close to the age that he gives when he dies. So is what he's saying, my Edward IV is Henry VII. So then my Edward V, the young innocent king full of promise, is the Henry VIII that we were going to get. You know, this 17-year-old strapping athletic guy who seemed like great fun, going to be a king full of promise. What you actually get in 1483, instead of that promise, is murdered by an evil tyrant who rules in all the wrong ways. And for me, that's the Henry VIII that England kind of gets in 1509, 1510.
Is Prince Arthur, effectively.
No, I think Edward V is meant to represent what Henry VIII should have been.
When he was younger and doing the jousting and all of that kind of.
So the heir to the throne is full of promise. He's going to be a great guy. He's going to be wonderful. He's going to, you know, be completely different to his father and all of that kind of thing. And then, you know, Edward V is murdered by Richard, and you get this monstrous tyrant in his place. And I think that is allegory for More's view that the real Henry VIII, once England came into contact with the kingship of Henry VIII, it destroyed the promise of Henry VIII, because he's executing people left, right and centre. Empson and Dudley, he executes them for doing what his dad had told them to do because he thinks it'll be popular. He's happy to murder people because he thinks people will like him for it. I mean, that's pretty psychopathic, sociopathic, I don't know, behaviour. But obviously, if you're Thomas More, you can't say, hang on, Henry, if you keep doing this, you know, Richard lived for 2 years and was then killed because of his wicked tyranny in More's story. You're not going to last for very long if you keep on in this vein of tyranny and monstrosity and everything else. So I think he's writing allegory, and I think he's just drawing a big parallel between Edward IV is Henry VII, Edward V is the promise of Henry VIII, Richard III is the Henry VIII you actually get. And
I think that comes full circle to what we said at the beginning about he doesn't even finish it. And it gives you a reason why he doesn't, because putting his name to something like that and releasing it, you know, maybe he, you know, it's just interesting.
It might have been too thinly veiled.
Yeah.
But also, as the 1510s move on, he's moving into royal service.
Yeah.
So is he now thinking, do you know what? I don't have to write from a distance about what Henry's doing wrong. I can get in there and influence him, and I can help him to be a better king and to rule in the right way. Instead of writing this piece that's, you know, thinly veiled attack on the way he's ruling, I can actually get in there and make a real difference myself and show him. And we know, for example, you know, More, alongside writing is Richard III, which, as we say, you know, he puts it on a shelf and forgets about it because I think he sees a different way to achieve what he's trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Alongside that, he's also writing Utopia, which is interesting in so many ways. It's the book that he does publish, so it's the one he does want us to read. And Utopia, it's one of the first fiction novels that is consciously fiction, that says, you know, this isn't the truth, because quite often people will write stuff in as history which is untrue. You know, think Morte d'Arthur, you know, it's written as history, the story of King Arthur. And Utopia is all about the perfect society. And it consists of lots of things that More, we know, doesn't agree with: married clergy, no private property, all of this sort of stuff. But the conversation that the characters in the book have is all about, you can never achieve this perfect society because you have to give advice to a selfish, self-centered prince that requires him to do stuff for the benefit of others. But because he's selfish and self-centered, he never will. So no matter how much advice you give him, however much good advice you give, he'll never take it. And it's interesting that that's the book that More publishes. The one that says, I'm going to give all this advice, but I just can't get through.
Yeah.
Because maybe that's his experience by the end of the 1510s. he's getting into royal service, or maybe he feels like he can give the advice, he can find a way to convince Henry. But he's consciously aware that if you enter royal service, you can give all the brilliant advice for the benefit of the country and the people that you want, but no king is ever going to take it because it's not to their own advantage. So he's kind of going into royal service conscious that he's liable to fail.
You make it all sound so credible, like that is it. That is the answer to the question. I mean, I'm sure lots of people will have things to kind of nitpick in your argument there, but when the way you present it does start to add up. It does start to make sense. And for me as an actor, coming back to the Shakespeare and the fact that Shakespeare writes a lot in irony, using irony, is that actually the best Shakespearean performers are the ones that find irony in places that you might not expect, because actually, Shakespeare at the time of his writing is, again, writing with the pressure of, the monarch in place and being, having to be sensible with what he's saying. So he gets characters to say things that, in the playhouses where there are no royalty coming to watch, they can actually make fun of them in a way. It's playing with these double meanings all the time. But at the same time, if somebody comes in and sits down who is, they do need to be careful of, they just say it very seriously, and no one's any the wiser,
it's the fool that cracks a joke, that if you actually look at what the joke is saying, you might think, oh, actually, how do you get away with that?
And I think,
even Shakespeare's Richard III. So I think you can read Shakespeare's Richard III in the same way as Thomas More, as allegory, in that it's talking about Robert Cecil and the Protestant succession and all of that kind of thing. So we just need to be aware that when people hundreds of years ago were writing, they weren't writing non-fiction history in the way that we would write it today. They were writing moral tales to educate governors, to deliver political messages, to deliver moral stories and messages to their audience. They weren't writing fact. I think Thomas More would be horrified if he thought we took what he'd written as fact.
Very few people write just facts. I think it's that thing of going as well, like writing then, reading books then, it was a much more elitist thing as well. The amount of people who had the ability to read and write, and the resources to do that as well. I would imagine that I'm no expert to say it, but I would imagine that writing had different meanings, and things that people were writing about and the way they would choose to write probably, reached out in a different way, and there were hidden meanings and things that we can't begin to imagine because we weren't there. We just don't know.
And I think we're aware of that in art and portraiture. People will look at a portrait of Elizabeth I and decode all of the messages that are in there. Why is that symbol there? Why is that this color? Why is she wearing that dress? Why is that in the background? They were very good at putting these meanings into paintings. What we've forgotten is that they put it into their writing as well. They did exactly the same thing, delivered messages in exactly the same way, but we see it in the artwork, we try to find it, but we don't look for it in the writing.
When I was editing one of the latest videos on the suffragettes, I came across this thing. I was talking about, the way that we're forced to write history essays in school, and sometimes that's a way of killing history rather than bringing it to life, because we're forced to kind of go through the facts, and it kind of kills it a little bit, in my opinion. But like, if we look at memes, for example, imagine in like 50 to 100 years time, people writing essays on the significance of memes, and like, they're never going to understand a meme we see today, because they're not part of the pop culture. They don't understand what it's referencing and necessarily whether it's used as tongue-in-cheek or whether it's used as fact. If they were to see a meme today that was uncovered, that literally says, is making a joke, and they believe it's fact, you can see how easily it's misleading, because suddenly a context is no longer there. It's probably a terrible example, but
it's a perfect example, because we should be aware of, we're looking back 500 years. What will future historians think in 500 years of what we're doing today? I kind of hate to think, but you're right. They would take a meme and they would examine that, but it would be out of context of the people who created it, who shared it, who smiled at it or laughed at it or whatever else. And we're looking at writing from 500 years ago, the likes of Thomas More, in exactly the same way, completely out of the context in which he was writing it, the world that surrounded him as he was writing that. And so we lose some of the meaning and the connections that he would have had to what he was writing and the messages he was trying to deliver, the beats of the story. And I think they're there if you look for them and try to unpick them. And this is very much my opinion. You're right. Lots of people will disagree with what I'm saying. and that's absolutely fine. That's what history is all about.
But what I do think, just coming to an end and kind of, finishing this off, but what I do think, what I found in this conversation, talking about the sources, is suddenly your mind is open to actually all these different interpretations of the history, but also the people who are writing these things. And suddenly you've just, with the Thomas More example, for example, you've brought up this other element of the period that I might not have heard of before, that I might go, actually, I'll look into that now, look into Thomas More and the time in which he is living, with the idea of thinking back and how it correlates and how it connects. The same with Mancini, about going, okay, well, actually, let's look at France and the world he's living in, his world, what's going on there, Angelo Cato, for example, looking into who he is. Again, you might initially think they're completely separate from what's going on in England at the time, and the Wars of the Roses and Richard III, but actually there is suddenly a connection, and it kind of expands that area of exploration for people watching this. And I think that's something that, even if people do disagree with you, I don't think it matters, because actually they might go and read up on these people who have had such an impact in the history that we know, but we would never think to look at ourselves.
That's it. And I think particularly with Mancini, it's easy, if you think he's an Italian who visited England and just happened to be here reporting on stuff, that is a very different complexion on his report than if you know, because he tells us in his introduction that he's working for Angelo Cato, who is personal physician and personal chaplain to the King of France at a time when those two countries are almost at war again. That is two very different things, but one of those is fact and one of those is a very light skim on the top of the truth. You peel that back and there is so much more to it, which may not change your opinion of what Mancini says, but it has to influence your reading of it, not least because you read his introduction and he tells you to be careful.
And I think that comes back to this idea of, we're solving a mystery. And I think everybody's look at history in a way is their own way of solving that mystery. There is, as you say, there's not necessarily a right and wrong with how you might see things, because people interpret things in different ways. But actually that, again, is the fun part of history, is you're kind of almost solving it, putting these pieces of the puzzle together. And as I've said, sources, we never talk about them enough. We never talk about them. We always drop them in and say, oh, Mancini said this, or Moore said this, or I disagree with Moore because of this. And we kind of pass it off. And actually, having talked to you today, I'm sure people are going to love hearing all of these thoughts that you have. And hopefully it will inspire them to go away and actually look more into these sources and find them, because you can access them online. I mean, as you say, there are Mancini, you can actually buy his work on Amazon now. So, I think that will be a really, again, it just brings a new light and a new angle on the history, because at the end of the day, we can all read a book on Richard III, hundreds of books on Richard III, but once you feel like you know it, you feel like you know it, but actually there's always more to uncover, and this is putting those pieces together. So I'm going to stop talking now, but thank you so much for joining us and talking through all of this incredible stuff with us. I found it really enlightening, and I'm sure other people will too. So thank you, Matt. And hopefully, guys, we'll see you again soon for another conversation on Swiping Through History. Thank you.